May 27, 1942, was an ordinary day in Pearl Harbor, at least on the surface. But beneath the sun-baked streets and the bustling docks, in a cramped basement filled with the hum of typewriters and the clatter of IBM punch card machines, history was quietly being rewritten. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was about to receive intelligence so precise it seemed almost impossible. Intelligence that would change the course of the war in the Pacific and ultimately the world. The message he received was simple in its clarity. The Japanese fleet would attack Midway Island on June 4th at 0700 hours, approaching from a bearing of 325 degrees, 175 miles northwest of the island. The source of this information was not a spy, not a captured officer, nor a dramatic reconnaissance flight, but a group of men working tirelessly in a dimly lit basement under the leadership of a man who defied convention in every way imaginable. This was the story of Station Hypo, the American codebreakers who turned cryptography into the deadliest weapon of war. Station Hypo, located in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was not glamorous. The building itself was unremarkable, a two-story structure tucked inconspicuously behind the waterfront. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink, coffee, and sweat. The basement was a hive of activity, filled with small rooms that smelled of paper and cigarette smoke. Here, in this maze of desks, chalkboards, and mechanical adding machines, worked the minds that would decipher what the Japanese considered unbreakable, JN-25, the top-secret naval code used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. This code had already confounded American cryptanalysts for years. Its complexity was staggering, a combination of numerical codes, additive ciphers, and constant changes that required daily updates. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To those in the basement of Station Hypo, it was a puzzle, a deadly puzzle whose solution could save thousands of lives. At the center of this operation was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man who looked out of place in a military uniform as he did in a formal office. He was eccentric, brilliant, and stubborn, often working 72-hour shifts in the basement, wearing a smoking jacket, slippers, and a half-dozen pens tucked behind his ears. He had a reputation for being unorthodox, yet his results were undeniable. Rochefort had a gift for patterns, a mind that could see order in chaos, and a conviction that intelligence was the most powerful weapon a nation could wield. He believed that war was not only fought with guns and ships, but also with knowledge, foresight, and cunning. And in the cramped, noisy basement of Station Hypo, Rochefort orchestrated an orchestra of mathematicians, linguists, and even former musicians from the USS California's band, all working toward a single goal: to break JN-25. The work was relentless. Messages from Japanese ships, often hundreds per day, would arrive in the basement already partially decoded by other units, but still largely indecipherable. Each message was a labyrinth of numbers, a complex combination of code groups and additives designed to thwart anyone who tried to make sense of it. The team would painstakingly reconstruct the codebooks, line by line, identifying recurring patterns, probable word combinations, and sequences that might hint at operational plans. They used everything available: manual cross-referencing, statistical analysis, and mechanical IBM punch card machines, which allowed them to process massive amounts of data far faster than any human mind could manage. Every new breakthrough was a small victory, celebrated quietly among the exhausted codebreakers with cigarette breaks and sips of lukewarm coffee. But there was one particular challenge that consumed their attention in late May 1942, the looming threat to Midway Island. The Japanese had already executed a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and intelligence suggested that they were planning another major operation. The question was where. Midway Island, a tiny atoll in the central Pacific, had become a focal point because of its strategic location. But the Japanese were masterful in deception. Their communications were careful, coded, and misleading. Breaking the JN-25 code was only the first step. Interpreting the information in a way that could predict enemy movements was an entirely different challenge. Rochefort's team began looking for subtle clues, anything that might indicate where the next attack would occur. They examined supply reports, reconnaissance requests, and even routine operational communications, searching for patterns that could not be explained by coincidence.
It was then that a small, seemingly trivial message appeared, a query from the Japanese command asking whether the water supply on AF had been sufficient. The notation AF could have been meaningless, a random code, but Rochefort's team suspected otherwise. They devised a brilliant ruse. They instructed Midway's personnel to report a water shortage under the code name AF. When the Japanese replied that AF was indeed short on water, the confirmation was complete. Midway was the target. This was not luck. It was deduction, cunning, and the application of a mind honed for pattern recognition. Rochefort's team had essentially tricked the Japanese into revealing their plans without a single bullet being fired. The revelation reached Admiral Nimitz through a briefing prepared by his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton. Layton had long been a liaison between Station Hypo and the Fleet Command, translating cryptanalysis into actionable strategy. On May 27, 1942, he presented the findings to Nimitz. The Japanese were planning an attack on Midway, and the time, date, and approximate position of the fleet were known. For the first time, American leadership could plan a counter-ambush with certainty. The implications were staggering. If Nimitz could position his limited forces correctly, he could not only defend Midway, but also strike at the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet that had decimated Pearl Harbor. The stakes were immense. The Japanese had 4 of their most powerful aircraft carriers in the Pacific: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. If the Americans could sink even a portion of them, the balance of naval power in the Pacific would shift dramatically. Over the next week, Nimitz orchestrated one of the most precise and daring naval maneuvers in history. Using the intelligence from Station Hypo, he positioned his forces in a hidden arc north of Midway, ready to ambush the Japanese fleet as it approached. The operation required meticulous timing and coordination. Aircraft carriers had to be positioned without revealing their presence. Reconnaissance planes had to scout the area, and fighter squadrons had to be ready for rapid deployment. Every move was calculated, every risk measured. Meanwhile, Rochefort and his team continued their work in the basement, refining the intelligence, confirming Japanese fleet movements, and ensuring that the predictions remained accurate. June 4, 1942 arrived with the tension of a world holding its breath. The Japanese fleet, confident in their secrecy and in the invincibility of their carriers, advanced according to their plan. They were unaware that every move, every encoded message had been intercepted, decrypted, and analyzed by Station Hypo. At 0700 hours, Japanese planes launched their attack on Midway, expecting a small garrison and limited resistance. Instead, they encountered a well-prepared defense, and more critically, the hidden American carriers struck back. Aircraft from the U.S. carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown attacked the Japanese fleet with devastating accuracy. In a matter of hours, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were sunk. The destruction was almost complete. Thousands of experienced Japanese sailors and aviators were lost, and the offensive capability of the Japanese Navy was irreversibly damaged. The Battle of Midway had ended, not with luck, but with the brilliant application of intelligence and strategy. The victory at Midway was more than a tactical success. It was a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese, who had once dominated the seas, were forced onto the defensive, and the momentum shifted to the Americans. The battle demonstrated that information, accurate, actionable intelligence, was as deadly as any weapon. The methods developed by Rochefort, from code-breaking to ingenious psychological ruses, became the foundation for modern signals intelligence. Agencies like the National Security Agency, NSA, would later build on the lessons learned at Station Hypo, applying rigorous cryptanalysis to national security on a global scale. Despite the monumental achievement, recognition for Rochefort was delayed by bureaucracy and politics. Station Hypo had succeeded, but the Washington establishment was slow to understand the magnitude of their contribution. Rochefort was reassigned to the Atlantic, denied the accolades that his brilliance had earned. It was only decades later, in 1986, that President Ronald Reagan awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously, acknowledging the profound impact of his work on the course of World War II. Commander Rochefort had not sought fame. He sought only to apply his intellect to the defense of his nation. Yet the world belatedly remembered. The story of Station Hypo is not just about cryptography. It is about human ingenuity under pressure. The mathematicians who calculated probabilities, the linguists who parsed obscure syntax, and even the former band members who found patterns in rhythmic repetition, all contributed to a mosaic of intelligence that proved decisive. They demonstrated that ordinary people, applying extraordinary minds to seemingly impossible problems, could alter the fate of nations. The basement of Station Hypo, cluttered with charts, teletypes, and punch cards, was a battlefield in its own right, a place where the war was fought with brains instead of bullets, with deduction instead of firepower.
The psychological aspects of the operation were equally remarkable. The AF water ruse is now celebrated as one of the most ingenious examples of deception in military history. It required a deep understanding of human behavior, anticipating that the Japanese command would probe for confirmation of targets. By exploiting this curiosity, Rochefort's team transformed a simple question about water supply into a strategic revelation that saved Midway and doomed the Japanese carriers. It is a testament to the idea that intelligence is not only about numbers and codes, but also about foresight, creativity, and the ability to think several moves ahead of one's opponent. As the months and years passed, the methods pioneered at Station Hypo became standard practice in intelligence operations worldwide. Cryptanalysis, once a niche discipline, became central to national security. The success at Midway provided a blueprint. Collect data meticulously, analyze it rigorously, and never underestimate the value of clever, lateral thinking. These lessons resonate even today, forming the core principles of signals intelligence and the work of modern cybersecurity and national defense agencies. The seeds sown in that basement under the leadership of a man in a smoking jacket had grown into a global paradigm of information warfare. The Battle of Midway itself has been studied extensively in military academies, its strategies dissected, and its outcomes analyzed. What is often overlooked, however, is the human story behind the victory. Commander Rochefort, Edwin Layton, and the team at Station Hypo exemplify the quiet heroism of those who operate in shadows, whose contributions are invisible to the public eye, but whose impact is monumental. They worked in conditions of extreme stress, with the knowledge that any error could result in catastrophe. Their dedication, ingenuity, and perseverance turned raw data into strategic advantage and proved that intellect could rival brute force in shaping the outcome of war. The narrative of Midway is also a cautionary tale about recognition and the politics of war. While the victory was celebrated, the individuals responsible for the intelligence that made it possible were often sidelined, overshadowed by traditional military hierarchy and the allure of visible combat heroism. Rochefort's reassignment and delayed honors reflect the sometimes unfair reality of how human contributions are valued in institutional contexts. Yet history eventually corrected this oversight, albeit posthumously, ensuring that the story of Station Hypo is remembered as a cornerstone of American military achievement. In the end, the story of May 27, 1942, is a story of precision, intellect, and courage. It is about the quiet confidence of men who understood that knowledge could be a weapon sharper than any sword or gun. It is about the intersection of human creativity, rigorous analysis, and the ability to act decisively when the stakes are incomprehensibly high. The intelligence delivered to Admiral Nimitz that day allowed the United States Navy to strike with surgical precision, transforming Midway from a potential disaster into a decisive victory. The echoes of that achievement continued to influence military strategy, intelligence operations, and the broader understanding of warfare in the modern age. Station Hypo's work demonstrated that the battle for information is as critical as the battle on the seas, and that sometimes the pen, or in this case, the punch card, is mightier than the sword. The men in the basement, from the mathematicians calculating frequencies of code groups to the linguists dissecting subtle variations in syntax, worked without glory, but with a profound sense of purpose. They understood that victory often belongs not to those who fight visibly, but to those who prepare invisibly, who anticipate, deduce, and act with foresight. When the Japanese carriers sailed into their trap on June 4th, they were confronting not just the American fleet, but the accumulated intellect of Station Hypo. Every torpedo dropped, every plane launched, and every explosion that sank a carrier was the result of meticulous preparation and brilliant deduction weeks in the making. The battle could have been lost by mere chance or error, but it was won by the quiet brilliance of those who refused to accept that the code was unbreakable. The legacy of this operation is immeasurable. It is a story of turning intelligence into action, of transforming abstract numbers into concrete victories, and of demonstrating that human ingenuity can overcome even the most daunting technical challenges. It is a story of perseverance, creativity, and dedication under pressure. The triumph at Midway, made possible by the work of Rochefort, Layton, and his team, remains one of the most striking examples of how information can define the outcome of history. In the shadows of a Pearl Harbor basement, history was rewritten, and the course of the Pacific War and, perhaps, the world was forever altered.